All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Shani and Avram Kelman, for dedicating all the Shemar Joshos this month in honor of Yechiel's engagement to Alana Falik and memory of their parents, Shulman Bernice Kelman, and Alexander and Frederica David, Zichron Livracha. To thank Barak, Maya, and Sandy Hoffman, Dora Limus, and Avi Malami for dedicating all the Shiurim this month in memory of Ruvain Ben Emmanuel Zichron Livracha. To thank Ayal and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating the Shiurim this month in Schosor of Fur Shalim of Shulamis Bas Susha. To thank the Daf Yomi share for dedicating the Shiurim this month in the Schosor of Rafur Shalim for Yehuda Ben Michal. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Louis Goldberg, sponsoring the Week of Learning in honor of the engagement of his grandson, Eli Bogart, to Rivi Galaskov. Mazel Tov. And to thank our Day of Learning sponsor, Steve Galaskov, in honor of his daughter Rivi's engagement to Eli Bogart of Baltimore. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. Beautiful. Well, so with that, let us begin. All right, we have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Ayin 70. We are picking up on Samech Tes Amud Beis 69b. Let's just pick up at the Gemara. Keep it simple, which is also where we left off, I think. So I just wanted to make it sound like we got a little further than we did. So we left off at the Gemara on Samech Tes Amud Beis. So let's remember again, the Mishnah introduced us to a fascinating case of Hamashlish Ma'os Libito. A man goes ahead and deposits money for his daughter in the hands of a third party. The daughter then says, daughter gets married, and again, as Rashi pointed out over here, in the Mishnah, the goal over here was that this was either to purchase a field or for Nadunya or for dowry purposes. The daughter goes ahead and says, give it to my husband. I trust my husband. He'll go ahead and take care of it. So remember again, we had a machlokis in the Mishnah as to what to do in such a situation like this. So ultimately again, Rabbi Meir says, no, the agent, the third party was entrusted with a particular shlichus. He should carry through on that shlichus. Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, says, look, at the end of the day, it's fine. So carry through on the shlichus, buy the field. Once she gets the field, what could she do? She could sell it anyway and give the money to her husband. So Lamaisa, what are you really saving by not following her wishes? Therefore, Rabbi Yossi says, if she wants the money given to her husband, ultimately, again, give it to her husband. The Mishnah then qualified that ruling and said, when is this true? With the Gedola, but ultimately, again, with the Ketana, her actions are meaningless. Now, we don't know what that phrase is going on. We're going to talk about that in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Tanabanan, Hamash l'shmos l'chosno likach men sadalibito. A man goes ahead and gives money to a third party, and the third party is in charge of purchasing a field for the man's daughter. So Reuven gives money to a shaliach to go ahead and purchase a field for his daughter Rachel. So ultimately, again, so if we hear Omeres, Yinasnu lebaili, and she says, listen, give the money to my husband. She says to the shaliach, just give the money to my husband. My husband will take care of everything. So the shayla is about say, what should we do? So mina nisuin harishus biyada. From now, interesting, the Brisa qualifies this a little bit differently. After she's already had nisuin, so she's a fully married woman. So the Maisa, okay, so she has the rishus to say that, give the money to my husband. Mina erisin ya'aseh hashalish mashehu shlosh biyado de Rabbi Meir. But ultimately, again, in erisin, the shaliach should not hand over the money. The shaliach should do as he was commanded. This is the position of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir's fundamental distinction is between erisin and nisuin. Erisin, we don't listen to the girl. The shaliach does what he was charged to do. Nisuin, he can give it over to the husband. Rabbi Yossi says, no. Hagidola, bein min hanisuin, bein min ha'erisin, harishus biyada. Kitana, bein min hanisuin, bein min ha'erisin, yasa shlish, mashu shlosh biyada. So we'll say, interestingly enough, Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, says, the distinction is not between the stages of marriage. The distinction is what? The age of the girl. If we're talking about a kitana, whether the ketana is in erisin or nisuin, lemaisa, the shaliach should do as he was charged to do. If she's a gedola, then whether it was erisin or nisuin, the shaliach should follow the instructions of the girl. My benayu. So we'll say, what's the nafkamina between these two approaches? First wide line. Maybe you'll say the fundamental distinction is a case of kitana who is in nisuin. Rabbi Meir Rabbi Meir holds that, look, once she's in nisuin, she has a right to dictate to the shaliach what to do with the money. And Rabbi Yossi comes along and says, listen, it doesn't matter nisuin erisin. What matters ultimately, again, is the age of the girl. So even if she's in nisuin, but she's a kitana, we let the shaliach hold on to the money and do as he was charged to do. However, here's the problem. Ema Seifa, remember again, let's go back to that strange last line of the Mishnah. What was the last line of the Mishnah? Aval b'ketana, ein ma'aseh ketana klum. But a ketana, her actions are meaningless. So man katanila. Who is the author, or literally again, according to whose position does that line make sense, or who's the author of that line? So even Rabbi Yossi, if it's Rabbi Yossi, hamiresha shamis mina, the Am Rabbi Yossi v'chi eina ela sadeh v'rotze l'machra harehu mechura me'achshav. Remember again, what did Rabbi Yossi say? Rabbi Yossi in the beginning of the Mishnah, listen, shaliach, just give the money over to the girl, or give it over to her husband, because anyway, what are you going to do? You're going to buy a field. You're going to buy a field. She's going to get the field. She's going to sell it and give the money to her husband anyway. So what are you accomplishing? So we'll say, for Rabbi Yossi to make that statement, he has to say what? Gidola de bas zevini in ketana de la bas zevini hi lo. Obviously, that statement only makes sense if what? If we're talking about a gidola. Why? Because in order for Rabbi Yossi's statement to make sense, you have to be talking about a girl or a woman who has the ability to sell something, who has the ability to engage in transactions. Only a gidola, not a ketana. Ella, Rabbi Meir, rather it must reflect the view of Rabbi Meir. That last line must be in accordance with Rabbi Meir. And there's a piece missing from the Mishnah, and here's how you are to read the Mishnah. Here we go. When we say that the shaliach should do that which he is entrusted to do, i.e., he was entrusted to buy a field for Rachel, for the daughter, he should execute that shlichus, and he should not just simply hand over the money to the girl. When is that true? Bigdola. I'm sorry. Mina irisin. When is that true? That's true when the girl is only in a state of irisin. Aval min hanisuin harishus piyada. But ultimately, again, if already Rachel is in nisuin and she's saying, just give the money to my husband, he will take care of everything, then ultimately, again, the shaliach should follow her instructions. However, a further qualification, when is that true? That we listen to the girl from nisuin, right? When is that true? Bigdola, when she's an adult. Aval biktana ein ma'aseh ketana klum. I will say ultimately again. So now, what we see what just happened over here? A double qualification. So I will say, so ultimately again, when do we listen to the girl? Aleph, when it's nisuin. Interesting, if you would have thought the order would have been a little bit different, but in other words, I would have thought the order is, when do we listen to her? Only from nisuin, and if she's a gedola. She's a gedola, which makes sense. In other words, nisuin, fully married, gedola, full maturation. So Lamaisa, she says, listen, don't buy me the field. My husband runs the finances, or he's in charge of property acquisitions. Give the money to him. So we'll say it must be that Allah Lamaisa, the case of gedola min ha'erisin is an afkamina. Itmar Rav Yehuda Amar. So listen to this. Itmar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel halach Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda is saying in the name of Shmuel that the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi. Rava Rav Nachman halacha Rabbi Meir. Rava said name Rav Nachman the halacha follows Rabbi Meir. So both say, so how do we paskin? I'm actually going to send this out to you a little bit later because it's actually a really interesting Rambam. The Rambam writes, this is in Hilchos Ishus Parachaf. We'll say what's really great, the whole last Gemara has all been the same parak in the Rambam. So it just happens to be, if you want to do a nice little chazara of the halachas, the pertinent halachas of the last few days, Hilchos Ishus Parak Chaf, it's all there. I will say, someone asked me a couple of days ago why I'm always quoting the Rambam and not the Shulchan Aruch. So the truth is, the reason just is, a lot of times just in the formulation of the halacha, the Rambam often quotes more elements of the sugya in his formulation of the halacha. So when you read the Rambam picks up, the Shulchan Aruch often just states a halacha. It doesn't necessarily give you any of the context of the sugya. I feel that for learning the daf and for getting halacha lamaisa, looking at a Rambam is always a little, I think, a little bit more helpful. But you should just know, when I'm quoting through the Rambam, it's also because the Shulchan Aruch paskins the same way. If the Shulchan Aruch were to paskin differently than the Rambam, I would share that with you. So listen to this halacha. Misha tziva lo says lebito kach v'kach mos laparnasasa. Likach ben karka, ben shayishchim nira, ben shayabari umeis, v'hari hamos biyad hashlish. See, even the Rambam like expounds on the case a little bit, which is not important for our purposes. Ruvain, the father, gives money over to a third party so that the third party should purchase karka for the daughter. Now again, the Rambam says maybe the father is a shchiv merah, he's on his deathbed. It doesn't matter. Point over here is father gave it over, and I will say, so what's the halacha? Now father died, by the way. The other point of this, and we're going to see why this is important in the next piece of Gemara. Father's dead. So now what's happening? Shaliach is vested with an agency to go ahead and purchase this land for Rachel, the daughter of Ruvain. Rachel says, what does Rachel say? Just give the money to my husband. I don't want you, don't purchase property from me. Give the money to my husband, he'll take care of it. Va'amra habas tenu osam labaili. So ultimately, again, and she says, give the money to my husband. So what's the halacha? Im haisa gidola v'nises harashos biyada. So what's that Rambam Paskins, which makes sense if you have both criteria are met, namely that she is a gidola and she has nisuin, we listen to her. V'madayin me'urases. But however, if she's an arusa, even if she's a gidola, then what? Ultimately, again, yaseh shalish ma shehushlosh biyado. Ultimately, again, if she's an arusa, even if she's a gidola, ultimately the shaliach should do what he was entrusted to do. Similarly, adayin kitanahi afilu nises in shomela. Similarly, if she's a kitana, even if she had nisuin, shaliach does not listen to her, but rather executes his agency. So therefore, Rabbi say that Rambam Paskins, just like the Gemara says, pretty much like Rabbi Meir, that halacha lemaisa, in order for her to get the money, she has to be a gedola and nisuin. If either one of those two criteria are not met, shalish, the shaliach, holds on to the money, executes in accordance with the wishes of Ruvain. Beautiful. Let's go weiter. We'll say an interesting story here. Ilfa talanavshe be'iskarya demakusa. Ilfa was suspending himself from the mast of a ship. Okay, now watch this. What did he say? Amar, Ika da'asi da'amrli milsa debe Rabbi Chia Rabbi Yoshia. If anyone could come and tell me a ruling of Rabbi Chia Rabbi Yoshia, v'lo pashit no lebi masnisin, and I can't find a support for their ruling from a Mishnah, nefila mi'iskarya v'tavana. I will let myself fall from the mast and drown in the sea. All right, shtickle drama over here, right? So what is this? So first of all, I take a look at Rashi. Ilfa Shem Chacham is name of Talmud Chacham. Talanav Shei Gufa de Uvda Meseches Tanis Mishum Da Svul Rabbi Yochanan Bereisha Kishalach Ilfa B'Schora. So I say, now listen to this. Listen to. So look at the Amar Kalman Da'asi. Look at Rashi. So Rashi says there is something absolutely amazing. Rashi says, why is he suspending himself in the mast of a ship? Kilomar, Afa pi shalachti b'schora, lo shachachti talmudi. Now let's say, this is so incredible. What does the ship represent? Commerce. Ilfa went into business. The previous Rashi records a whole discussion of Maseches Tainis, ultimately again, that Ilfa could have been the Rosh Yeshiva, but he went into business, and instead they appointed Rabbi Yochanan as the Rosh Yeshiva. So I will say, this is incredible. When Ilfa was suspending himself from the mast of the ship, essentially what he was showing was, the fact that I went into business in no way diminished my excellence in Torah, which I will say is such a profound idea, that sometimes we think that in life there's like an either or. Either I could be a great Talmud Chacham, and that's like to the exclusion of being part of the world, right? To the exclusion of having a career, to the exclusion of being financially successful, or I could be financially successful and be a part of the world and be accomplished. But that's to the exclusion of my Torah knowledge. Now the truth is, Rabbi said, the Gemara, I've mentioned this before, the Gemara has a beautiful expression of lo kol adam ochel al shtei shulchanos. Most people don't eat at two tables. What are the two tables? The two tables, one table is the table of spiritual accomplishment, Torah accomplishment. The second table is the table of financial accomplishment. Most people don't eat at both tables. I will say the reason why most people don't eat at both tables is why? Because most people don't push themselves hard enough. But Lamaisi, you can eat at both tables, right? They say you can't dance at two chasanas. It's not true. Certain two chasanas you can. You can dance at the chasana of Torah accomplishment, the Torah of, and the chasana of material accomplishment as well. You have to work really, really hard, but it's possible. I will say this is so important because sometimes, again, we think that if I have a day job, that exempts me from becoming a Talmid Chacham. I just have to be a balabas. I don't have to be a Talmid Chacham. Not true. Every Jew has an obligation to try to become a Talmid Chacham. Whether I become one or not is a different discussion, but I have to try. Se'ilfa is making this dramatic display, right? Just dramatic display. Right? I would say he's suspending himself by the mast of the ship. Essentially what he's saying is, ask me anything. Ask me anything. Specifically, what he's saying is, ask me any ruling of Rabbi Chir and Rabbi Oshia, and I will prove them. I will support that from a Mishnah. And again, the ship representing commerce. I am rooted in commerce, but that in no way has led to the diminution of my Torah knowledge, my excellence in Ruchnius. And if not, I'll let myself drown. That's probably a bit hyperbolic, but again, he was trying to make a point. So what happens? So the Gemara says as follows. Good. Asa Saba, an old man came along, Tonale, and asked the following question. Omer tenu shekel lebni b'Shabbos. What's a very interesting case? A father comes along and says like this, right? Ruvain comes along and says he's making an arrangement over here. He's making an arrangement over here for his sons even after his death, or it could be even during his lifetime. The point is, he says over here, says to a third party, Tinu shekel lebni b'Shabbos. Give my son a shekel. Rashi says over here, shekel, the equivalent of that is a half a selah. Give a half a selah to my son each week for his support. Okay. Here's the only problem. The sons really need a selah. For their support. So the father says to the third party, give my kids, my boys, a half a selah, but the boys really need a whole selah to be able to take care of their needs. So what's the halacha? No stilum selah, we give a selah. Why do we give a selah if the father only said half a selah? Because we assume, what did the father mean? What is the father telling the third party? Support my sons. I want my sons to be supported. Give them what they need. So we assume the father said a half a selah. But what he meant was support. Half a selah was just an expression. What he meant was support. Vim Amar. However, listen to this. Now Rashi says over here, no some look at the Y lines of Rashi, 3 lines when they get Y. Di have a yada sheis yakru. Hamazonos lo have Amar. Had the father known that food became more expensive, he would have given his sons the full selah. However, listen to this. Vim Amar al titnu lahem ela shekel. Listen to this. If he phrased it differently, if he said, do not give my sons more than a shekel. So we'll say, in this case, what he's doing is, you see, when the father says, give my sons a shekel, we kind of look at that statement as a floor. This is what I think they need, but should they need more, give them more. When he says, do not give my kids more than a shekel, then that statement is what? A ceiling. And if it's a ceiling, you can't give them more than a shekel. Shekel. Listen to this. Vim Amar imesu yershu achirim tachtayim. They both say, listen to this. If the father says that if my sons pass away, I want so-and-so to inherit the right to that shekel, then bein shamar tenu, bein shamar al titnu, inoslim ela shekel. Then whether the father said, give them a shekel, or don't give them more than a shekel, we only give them a shekel. Why? Here's what's interesting. Because since the father explicitly articulated about what happens with this support, if his sons were to die, and he's assigning that interest to someone else, indicates to us what? That he wants something residual left in the estate. So because he wants something residual left in it to pass on to someone after his sons, Therefore, we assume that he is explicitly limiting the support to the shekel. Amazing. So Amrle, so this old man says to Amemar, to Ilfa, excuse me. So Amrle Hamani, or I should say Amemar says back, who is this? Top of Ayin, Rabbi Meir. This is Rabbi Meir. The Amar mitzvah l'kayim divrei hames. Right, Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, it is a mitzvah to go ahead and uphold the words of the deceased. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Okva, Hilchasa. The truth is, the real halacha is bein sha'amar tnu, bein sha'amar al titnu, nosnin lahem kol tzarcham. So we'll say the way we pass halacha l'maisa, whether the father said in this case, only give the kids a shekel, or I should say, whether he said, give them a shekel, or do not give them more than a shekel, if it turns out that they really need a selah for their support, then what do? We give them a selah. The Gemara said, but 1 second. But you just said before they pass like Rabbi Meir. And what does Rabbi Meir say? It is a mitzvah to uphold the words of the deceased. And Abba said, let's go back for just a moment. If the father said that what? Do not give them more than a shekel, then how can you add on to that? Listen to this. So I will say, ultimately, again, that is true in other areas. See, I will say, at the end of the day, if a father is stipulating support for his sons, then b'pashtus, what does he want? He wants them to be supported. So if he lowballed support and he said only give them a shekel, a half a selah, but they need a whole selah, we understand that if he's already going out of his way to stipulate support, then lemaisa, he wants them to be supported. So if they need not half a selah but a whole selah, that's what we'll do. So I will say begs the question, which is, if that's the case, then why didn't the father just say to the shlish, give my kids support? Why did he stipulate a lower amount? I will say this is incredible. V'hada amar hachi lizarzinhu hu da'asa. I will say this is incredible. Ultimately, again, so why did the father articulate a lower amount? Because he doesn't want his sons to simply rely on handouts. In other words, he said a lower amount in order, look at Rashi for just a moment, Lazar-zinu, sheyachzuru achar mizonosehen, v'shelo yurav sanin. Number one, he wanted them. In other words, it's good for a kid to think that the trust fund doesn't have all of the money he needs, right? It's good. So it's good for the son to think, you know what, my father left me an allowance, left me an amount, but it's not enough, right? I'm going to have to hustle a little bit. It's good to hustle. Furthermore, that's Aleph, number one. Number two, the kid shouldn't eat whatever he wants. He should think twice about what he's spending money on. So it's interesting. So the way we interpret the father's statement is that the father wants his son to be supported. And therefore, if the amount articulated does not cover the needs of the son, we assume that the father meant an increase in that amount. So he said, give my kid a shekel, but a half a selah. But everyone knows that you need a full selah. Okay, that's the amount we're going to give them. But father, why don't you just say what you mean? There's an element of chinuch over here. The father is dafka saying a lower amount, Aleph, because he wants the sons to hustle, Beis, because he wants them not to be gluttonous in their behaviors. Beautiful. Tanan Hasam, Hapuatos, Mekchan Mekach, Umemkaran Memkar. Shabbos says, listen to this. The Puatos. Who are the Puatos, or Puutos? Rashi says, Tinokos b'nei Teisha Ushmona. We'll say these are children of 8-9 years old. The idea over here of a child who's 8-9 years old is they've reached some level of maturity. Granted that they're still kitanim, but lamaisa, they're not kitanim, right? They're old enough to have some level of das. Listen to this. Hapuatos mekchan mekach, umemkaran memkar. So young children, their sale is a sale. I should say their purchase is a purchase, their sale is a sale. Machar b'metaltalim says, Machar b'metaltalim. What happens if halacha l'marit? So umemkaran mechar b'metaltalim, sorry. And so their purchase is a purchase, their sale is a sale when it comes to movable property. Look at Rashi. B'metaltali, dafka. Aval b'mekarkoi lo ad she'aviu shtei sa'aros ad she'e ben esrim. So it says, we're going to, as the Gemara is going to suggest, halacha l'mais, here's what's fascinating. If a child is 8 or 9 years old and displays some level of intellectual agility, right, some level of intellectual acumen, so again, his transactions will be valid in metaltalin, but not karka. Not karka. I'm a Rafram, so let's qualify this. Lo shana elashem shana apotropis. This is only true if there's no apotropos. Let's say again, so let's say the kids, boys 8, 9 years old, inherit an estate, and now they're selling stuff. So now the Gemara says, when it comes to metaltalin, ultimately their transactions will be binding and valid. When it comes to karka, not so. Rafram comes along and says, by the way, that's only if there's not an apotropos, an executor, someone in charge of the estate. Aval yeshim apotropos in mekar memkar. But ultimately, if there's an apotropos, the kids are not really legally allowed to do anything. So the Gemara says, Mimai, from where do I know this from? Midiktani, because what did the Mishnah say? Ein ma'aseketana klum. Remember again, the Mishnah, in our Mishnah, we're talking about a similar case. What we're talking about, there's money in the hands of a shlish, right? There's money in the hands of a third party. So ultimately, what did the Mishnah say? The actions of a kitana are absolutely meaningless. Svidilma heicha diika shlish shiny. Maybe the case of a shlish is a little bit different. Imkein listening about the kitana yase shlish, right? Mashul shlish biyado. If that's the case, let the Mishnah say, in the case of a kitana, let the shlish do what he was entrusted to do. My ain ma'ase kitana klum. What does it mean that the actions of a kitana are meaningless? Shmamina afilu ba'alma. It comes to teach us that any time that there is an apotropos-like figure in the lives of the kitanim, the actions of the kitanim are never legally or halachically binding. So here you see something very interesting. You could potentially have a scenario where a katan is transacting some level, transacting transactions, doesn't make sense, right? Transacting business. When can you have a situation? Interestingly enough, in a case of a boy who's 8 or 9 years old, so somewhat mature, he could deal with metaltalin, not karka. But the moment that there is an apotropos, in other words, the moment that there is an adult who is involved and responsible for the finances, ultimately that removes any transaction abilities from the children. And indeed, that is how he passed halacha. So I'll say, Hadron halach, B'tzias Isha, Mazel Tov, Hamadrius Ishto, so listen to this. Interesting case. A man makes a neder that his wife cannot get any benefit from him. And I both say, beforehand, we were talking about Hana'as Tashmish, right? That's not this. This is more in terms of like a support or earnings capacity. So a man makes a neder that, look at Rashi just a moment. So I will say, so what we're talking about over here, sounds like what we're talking about is support. That's what it sounds like. So a man makes a neder, essentially saying that his wife is not permitted to get support from him. That's what it sounds like. So the Gemara says, Ad lamid yamid parnis. So we'll say, if the neder goes up to 30 days, fine. What could he do? He could support her through a third party. What does he need to support her through a third party? Exactly what it sounds like. Give the third party money, and that third party will give the wife the money. That way she's supported not from the husband, but from the agent. Again, we'll question the Gemara. Yes, Semikan, Yotzi v'yisin ksuva. We'll say if he makes an neder for more than 30 days, this is already, again, a little shtickle abnormal. I mean, 30 days is abnormal already, but 30 days we're willing to give them the time to kind of work this through. More than 30 days, the Gemara says this is not a sustainable marriage, and therefore the halach is he has to divorce her and ultimately pay her ksuva. Okay, so the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda says, well, it depends. B'Yisrael chodesh echad yekayim ushnayim yotzi, right? V'tein ksuva. So we'll say, Rabbi Yehuda says, he makes an interesting distinction. If it's Yisrael inachinami, we'll go like this. If the neder is for 1 month, ultimately, again, he could sustain her through a third party. More than 1 month, you have to divorce her, give her a ksuva. B'kohen, shnayim yekayim u'shloshe yotzi v'tein ksuva. By a kohen, if the neder is up to 2 months, ultimately, again, will allow him to do this, to sustain her through a third party. But Lamaisa, if it's more than 2 months, i.e. the neder extends into a third month, then he has to divorce her and give her a ksuba. Rabbi say, why does Rabbi Yehuda make a distinction between a Kohen and an Yisrael? Very simple. Because if Yisrael divorces his wife and then has a change of heart, then what? He could remarry her. A Kohen could not. So essentially what we're doing over here, says Rabbi Yehuda, is we're going to give the Kohanic couple a little bit more time to work this through. See, here's what's interesting. The Gemara obviously sees when a husband is making a neder that I'm not going to support you, right? You can't derive any benefit from me. Obviously, there's something wrong in the marriage. So essentially what the Gemara is saying, what the Mishnah is saying is, we're going to give them some time to resolve it. If they can't resolve it, the husband should divorce his wife and give her a ksuba. All Rabbi Huda is saying is by a kohen. And again, I will say there's kind of like, and again, what's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is they get divorced. They have a change of heart. They can get remarried, assuming she doesn't marry someone else in the interim. They can get remarried. By a kohen, where you don't have that recourse, you don't have the ability to get back together after divorce, Rabbi Huda just says, give them a little bit more of a little bit longer of what? Of a reconciliation window. So let the neder go up to 2 months for potential reconciliation, up to the 3rd month, then they get divorced. Next, hamadris ishto shlo titom echa mikol haperos. Interesting case. Let's say a man, and I will say the lashon over here is a little bit deceiving. It sounds like a man is making a neder that his wife cannot taste a particular fruit. Now Rashi says that's actually not the case. Look at Rashi. Rashi says echa mikol haperos konim pri ploni alai v'hu kiyem la. Actually, the case is where she makes a neder, right? Reuben's married to Rachel. Rachel makes a neder. Konim alai, I hereby make a neder, right? That apples should be forbidden to me. Okay? And he says, Amen. You know, he wants to be a supportive husband, right? So he goes ahead and says, right? He says, Amen. He says, now both say, now just, I want to point something out. Remember, when a husband affirms a neder, that's when the neder of wife becomes. So a husband affirming the neder, as much as the wife is the one that made the neder, the Mishnah sees as the husband making the neder kind of restricting his wife. So that's how the lashon over here is, Hamadir es ishto shlo titom echa mikol haperos. So again, he's confirming the neder she made to prohibit herself from a type of fruit. Yotzi v'tein ksuba. He has to divorce her. Yes, divorce her. Now again, we'll discuss. That seems pretty severe. We'll see why that is. Rabbi Huda Omer b'Yisrael yom echad yikayim shnayim yotzi v'tein ksuba u'bekoyin shnayim yikayim u'shlosha yotzi v'tein ksuba. So we'll say. So once again, so first I'll point out, by the way, by the pre, what it sounds like is that there's no like extended duration. Once the husband affirms that neder, there's a day. So again, ultimately, if you don't find the way out of the neder, he should divorce her and give her a ksuva. Rabbi Huda says, well, if it's Yisrael, give it a day. If it's a Kohen, give it 2 days. Same idea. Next case. Interesting case. Let's say a man makes a neder. Rabbi say once again, it's not the man making the neder. It's the woman making the neder. So Rachel comes along and she says, Konam alai bosem ploni. So for example, she says, Konam alai, perfume should be konam to me. I'm not going to wear perfume. Right? I'm not going to wear perfume. And husband says, Amen. Yes, dear. Right? Amen. Yes, he affirms the neder. So what's the halacha? Yotzi v'tein ksuva. Once again, I will say, now again, we do not know why. Brother, how strange is this, right? Lemaisa, he makes a neder not to support her. They've got 30 days to work this through. She makes a neder. I'm not going to wear perfume. Both not going to wear perfume. He says, Amen. Boom. Yotzi v'tein ksuva. Divorce, right? Yotzi v'tein ksuva. Rabbi Yossi Omer. So Rabbi Yossi makes an interesting distinction. So the halach is Yotzi v'tein ksuva. Rabbi Yossi Omer ba'anios shelo nasan kitzva. Rabbi Yossi again says something very interesting. It depends who the woman is. If she's poor, and I will say, interestingly enough, remember again, so if she's poor women in general did not necessarily use perfume. And therefore, again, the neder is only problematic if it's a neder without an end. However, ashiros, if she's a rich woman, the problematic duration of the neder is 30 days. Take a look at Rashi. Last Rashi in the Mishnah. Actually, not last Rashi, sorry. Ba'anios shlo nasan kitzva, be'isha aniya imlo nasan kitzva ladavar. So we'll say if the woman is poor and she made this neder, right, that perfume should be konam. Konam is a lashon of neder, right? That perfume should be asura to me. And the neder was made without duration. Ad masa asrala, so the Gemara says, Hudi yotzi v'tein ksuva. Aval nasan kitzva, tamtin ad osazman. So what's interesting is if she's a pauper, the only time this neder triggers the need for immediate divorce and ksuva is when is when if there was no time limit put on the neder. If it was just a neder, the olam vayed. But if there was a time limit put on the neder, just wait until the time limit, and there's no need for divorce in ksuva. However, again, if the woman was rich, Rashi says, and therefore she was accustomed to putting on perfume, the maximum duration of the neder is 30 days. More than 30 days, we would force them to get divorced. Less than 30 days, ultimately, we allow the neder to kind of play out. Good. Let's go back. So we'll say we're going to focus now on the first part of the Mishnah. What was the first part of the Mishnah? A man makes a neder to what? To prevent his wife from getting benefit from him. And we're understanding benefit now as what? Mizonos, support. So what did the Mishnah say? What did the Mishnah say? As long as the neder is not more than 30 days, right? What can he do? He could support her through a third party. So says the Gemara, one second. How could a husband make a neder not to support his wife? He's obligated to support his wife. And I've said we've learned this concept before, that when you make a neder to undermine a pre-existing obligation, what's the status of that neder? Null and void. So what's going on over here? Is he believed? Is he allowed to undermine a pre-existing obligation? Vatanan, we learned, here we go. If a man goes ahead and makes a neder, konam, then I'm not going to support you, you don't have to even annul such a neder. Why? Why, Abosai? Because it's invalid. It's invalid. You can't make a neder that runs against a pre-existing obligation. Alma, kevin the mishab delay, lav, this is the opposite case. In other words, this is where she makes a neder, not to go ahead and bring in certain things to the household. I'm not going to do my domestic responsibilities or bring in whatever. So I will say, again, such a neder is void. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, there's a pre-existing obligation. Therefore, again, Almo kevin the mishab delay, lav kol kamine de mafkale l'shibude. Hachanami kevin the mishubadla, lav kol kamine de mafkale l'shibude. So what's going on over here? So how could a husband make a neder? I hereby make a neder, right? I vow it is usher for me to give any benefit to you. I can't support you. What are you talking about? You have a pre-existing obligation. If a neder butts up against a pre-existing obligation, the neder is void. Ella, see, here's what's interesting. I will say. The Gemara says, well, there are scenarios where a husband doesn't have to support his wife. What are some scenarios like that? Where he says to her, listen, keep your earnings, and ultimately, again, I am free from giving you mizonos. Right? You can say that, but remember we had this machlokes about how do we view the rabbinic enactment? Is it that Chazal gave the husband earnings, and therefore because of that he has to give her mizonos, or no, they gave him mizonos, and therefore he has to give her earnings, and it's not just a question of semantics. So for example, he could say to her, listen, you make money, keep your earnings, and I don't have to give you mizonos. Since he could say that, Amadeus, Naaseh ke'omer lo, si'i ma'aseh yadech b'mizonoseich. Sefer Avosah, here's what's interesting. When a husband makes a neder, right, like the neder in the Mishnah, Hamadir ishto melahanoslo. So Reuven makes a neder, Rachel, you cannot get any benefit from me. It's not such a big deal, because what is he effectively saying to her? Si ma'aseh yadech b'mizonoseich. Keep your earnings. And when you keep your earnings, ultimately, again, I am freed from a mizonos obligation. Okay, then misalaha. So I'll say, but if that's true, what about the following statement? So the Gemara says, well, okay, so fine. If that's the case, Rabbi say, if that in fact is true, which Rabbi say is a very interesting approach. But if that in fact is true, the reverse should work as well. Right? Let's say a woman says to her husband, so Rabbi Huda said the name of Rav, right? Ultimately, again, I'm not accepting mizonos from you, and therefore I'm going to keep my earnings. Then Abosai, when she makes a neder, right? She says to her husband, I make a neder that I can't give you any benefit. Remember, what did we just say before? When a woman makes such a neder, she doesn't even have to annul the neder. The neder is void. Why is the neder void? Because it runs up against the pre-existing obligation. But one second, you just said that when the husband makes the equivalent neder to his wife, it works. Why does it work? Because it's as if he's saying, keep your earnings, and I'm not going to give you mazonos. Why don't we say the same thing over here? When she makes the neder, it's as if she's saying, keep your mazonos, and I'm going to keep my earnings. Why isn't it a valid neder which requires revocation? To which the Gemara says, since she could say, I'm not going to take your support, and therefore I'm not going to give you my earnings. So what's going on over here? Ella lo tema nasa. So Rabbi said this is very interesting. Rather, ultimately, again, so Rabbi, remember again, let's keep our eye on the ball. What are we trying to figure out over here? Mishnah began with a case, right? What was the first case of the Mishnah? A man makes a neder prohibiting himself from giving any benefit to his wife. Giving any benefit, we're understanding means what? Means what? Support. Mizonos. How can you even make such a neder like that? How can you make a neder like that? After all, again, you're making a neder that undermines a pre-existing obligation for a husband to support his wife. So the Gemara wanted to suggest originally, when he makes the neder, that's the equivalent of saying what? Of saying what? Keep your earnings. Keep your earnings and use it for your mizonos. The problem with that explanation is then that should work in both directions, and it doesn't work in both directions. So Ella lo tema naase, Ella ba'omer la si'i maase yadech mizonosech. No. The Gemara says that's the actual case of the Mishnah. The case of the Mishnah where we say that a husband makes a neder prohibiting his wife from getting benefit is where he actually says to her, so we wanted to say making the neder, it's like he says to her. The Gemara says, no. What's the case of the Mishnah? Not it's like he says to her, but rather what? He says it. He says it to her. Keep your earnings, and I'm not going to give you mazonos. If that's the case, ihachi parnes lamala. So we'll say, why is there a need for a third party? Remember again, what did the Mishnah say? Man makes the neder, I'm not going to support my wife. So what does he do? For 30, assuming it's within 30 days, right? He goes in and supports her through a third party. But one second, if he's saying to her, keep your earnings, and I'm not going to support you, then why is there any obligation for a third party? Why does he have to support her through a third party? To which the Gemara said, bidalo sapka. Ultimately, we'll say, why? It's a case where her earnings do not generate enough money for her own support. And therefore, again, what is he doing over here? What is he doing? He has an obligation to make up the shortfall. Ibidalo sapka hadar kushin leduchtayu. He'll say, but one second, let's go back for just a second. If halacha l'maisa, so let's play this out. If halacha l'maisa, right, we're saying now, what's the case? What's the case? He's saying to her, keep your earnings. I'm making a neder. Right, Reuben's making a neder. Rachel, I'm making a neder that you can't get any benefit from me. I'm not going to support you. And essentially, what he then says to her is, keep your earnings in lieu of the mazonos. But if now we're talking about a case where Rachel does not earn enough money to support herself, so we're back to our original question, then how does the neder work? Because the neder is still undermining his pre-existing obligation. To which the Gemara says, no. What's the case? When we say ultimately again, she can't support herself, what it means is, Amar Bashi, b'misapekes ledvarim gedolim, ve'ena misapekes ledvarim kitanim. She makes enough money to take care of the big things, but not enough money to take care of the small things. Okay, so by the way, what exactly are small things? Right? Hani dvarim katanim heichi dami. I'll say, what are these small things that we're talking about? We'll say, if these are small things that are just part of her lifestyle, then ultimately, again, small things are big things. And if she's not accustomed to them, then why would the husband be obligated to make up the shortfall? Here we go. This is fascinating. So let's listen to this. The small things are small. Now again, the Gemara still doesn't define what small things are, but let's listen to this. These are small things. These are small things that ultimately, again, she was used to going ahead and receiving in her husband's home. Watch this. So I'll say this is incredible. The kamagalgala bahadei. So we'll say ad ha'idna delo adrasan galgila bahadach. We'll say listen to this. So these are things, that she was used to from her family's home. Listen to this. Used to from her family's home. So listen to this. We'll say it's an incredible Gemara. So she says, she engages him in the following conversation. She says, Ata idna de lo adartan galgalina bahadach. Hashta da adartan lo matzina de galgal bahadach. So we'll say it's incredible. She says to him, listen, when we were living together, and you didn't give me these small things, it's fine. We were living together. We were a team. We're a team. Now that you made this neder and we're living apart and you're supporting me from a third party, I'm going to be asking for my due. Right? I'm going to ask you for what I feel I am actually entitled to. What Shabbos say, by the way, is such a profound Gemara. What the wife is saying is, look, if we're a team and we're in this together and there are certain things I can't have, it's okay. It's okay. Marriage is all about sacrifices. Building a life is all about sacrifices. I'm willing to make the necessary sacrifices if we are biyachad, if we're together. But now you're going to pull shtick, right? Now this is where we're holding. Now suddenly you're making the darim. Well, you're a big shot making the darim, right? Supporting me again by a third party. Now other people are involved in our lives as well. You know what? That's fine. That's fine. By the way, I'm going to need this allowance. I'm going to need that allowance. I'm going to this. I'm going to that. And she says, we'll say, which is such an, which again, this is my sim b'chol yom. It's my sim b'chol yom. When spouses feel part of a marriage, they're willing to make sacrifices for the other because ultimately, again, we have a common goal of building a life together. But the moment that team kite is gone, that we're not a couple, we're not a unit, we're just two people existing in the same sphere, then suddenly what happens? I no longer work for us, I work for me. And the wife, by the way, the husband did it first, right? Because remember again, he's the one that started with this neder. So she says, I got it. We're not a team. We're not a team. There's not us, there's you, and there's me. So if there's you and there's me, that's fine. I'm going to take what I am entitled to. Let's say such an incredible Gemara. Umayshna adla miyom. Shabbos say, fine. So now we'll say, now what we've established is that halacha l'maisa. Here's what we got. Here's what we got. That essentially the husband is making this neder, and at the same time is saying to her, keep your earnings for your mazonos. So if that's the case, why does he need a third party to help support her? Very simple, because what's happening over here? She doesn't make enough money. Okay, so therefore I will say again, but if she doesn't make enough money, again, so then isn't the neder running contrary to his pre-existing obligation? No, she makes enough money for we'll call it the necessities. Not the necessities, but ultimately, again, the smaller things she doesn't make enough money for, that's where he's obligated to make up the shortfall. Incredible. So we'll say, here's the question. Why is the maximum duration of the neder 30 days? Why 30 days? In other words, why is it that up to 30 days, the neder is fine? In other words, when we say fine doesn't mean fine. But what does fine mean? Fine means we're not going to force them to get divorced. But more than 30 days, he has to divorce or give her a ksuva. To which the Gemara says incredible, because adla yom lo shami ba inshi. People don't hear about it for 30 days. V'lo zela b'milsa, and it's not degrading for her. Tfei shami ba inshi v'zela b'milsa. We will say more than 30 days, people hear about it, and then that's embarrassing for her. And she is not obligated to remain in a marital situation that is embarrassing, humiliating, and degrading for her. So therefore, more than 30 days, we force him to give her a get and divorce. The other possibility is, other possibility is that what's the case over here? What's the case in the Mishnah? He made this neder when she's in Arusa. Arusa, to which the Gemara says, Mi isle mizone, an Arusa, there's no support obligation for an Arusa. Second, there's no support obligation for an Arusa, says the Gemara. What's the case? So, Shegia Zman Velo Nisu. We'll say, taking us back to the beginning of Kesuvos. We'll say, what's the case? The case is where halacha l'maisa, she's in Arusa, remember again, but the time for Nisuin came along, and what happens? He didn't marry her. We'll say, what happens if the year elapses after Erusin and the husband doesn't marry the wife? What happens? Support obligation is triggered. This none. First one line, I'll say, Higias man velo nisu. If the time for nisuin came along and they didn't get married, ocheles mishlo v'ocheles betruma. Ultimately, what? Halacha l'maisa, he supports her. So the Gemara suggests that's the case in the Mishnah. The case of the Mishnah, where ultimately again is making the neder is a case of Erusin. Well, if that's the case, umay shnat shloshim yom. We'll say, so ultimately again, so why only 30 days? So in other words, why is the neder capped at 30 days? To which the Gemara says, this is incredible. Ad shloshim yom avid shliach shlichusei, tfei lo avid shliach shlichusei. We'll say this is profound. Because remember again, what happens during the 30 days? The wife is supported through a third party. Now we'll say, what's the maximum amount of time that you could depend on the shliach to do a shlichus? 30 days. We'll say, by the way, what a profound piece of human nature. people have difficulty with consistency. When we say people, right? Whenever we say people, right? People always sounds like you're talking about someone other than yourself, right? I will say, what is the greatest struggle we all have in life? Is consistency. So the Gemara says human nature is most people could be consistent in performing a task for up to 30 days. More than 30 days, that's where inconsistency kind of comes in. So therefore, a man, now this Rachel's support is dependent on the consistency of the Shaliach. How long could we count on the Shaliach being consistent? 30 days. 30 days, incredible. The other possibility is Kishadir Kisharusa, Venises. The case, or we'll say ultimately, could also be where he made the neder when she was in Arusa, and then they did Nisuin. So the Gemara says, Nises Hasavar V'Kibla. We'll say, but 1 second, if he made this neder when she was in Arusa, and then they had Nisuin, Rabbi said that means that she entered into Nisuin with the understanding that this neder was there. Which means Rabbi said that what? She accepted this Tanai of marriage. If that's the case again, even if the neder goes on past 30 days, why should he have to divorce her? The Amra Kisvura Ani Shechola Lekabel, Achshav Ein Ani Yechola Lekabel. I will say this is incredible, where she says, you're right, I got married knowing there was a neder, and I thought I could live with this neder. I thought I could live with it. Now I got married and I realized that what? I can't live with it. To which the Gemara says, Emer Darminon Hachi Gabi Mumin Le'in Mezoni Mi Aminon. So I will say, I understand, I will say, by the way, we're going to see this. That is an interesting thing. If a woman marries a man with a mum, and then after they get married, she says, you know what, I need out. I can't do this. We said, what do you mean you can't do it? You knew about the mum before you got married. She says, you're right, I knew about the mum. I thought I could live with it. I can't. Now, so I will say, it's only in mumin that we accept such a taina like that. In finances, we generally would not. In other words, if she gets married with this neder intact, halacha ma'aseh, she knows about it. She gets married, she accepts it. She can't turn around and then say, oh, I can't live with it. Rather, the Gemara says, Ella, mechavarta kiddush meikar. Therefore, the Gemara says, you're right. We advanced 3 different answers on understanding the Mishnah. The first 2 work, the last one doesn't. Rabbosai, we will stop over here for today. Shkoyach. Good day, Jack.